All right. All right. So this is going to be the start of a series of conversations, more like curious conversations on this topic of authenticity. So I guess I'll start. I'm Emily. I call myself a NeuroManifestation coach. Really, my mission, I've come to realize, is healing through reconnection. And so Oscar and I really connected on this idea of authenticity and what it means and why it's so important to be authentic. So, to introduce yourself real fast, Oscar.
Yeah, no, I'm excited. This is the first of many, I think, conversations we're going to have. My name's Oscar. I am a coach, a certified coach, and my specialty is authentic living. And within authentic living, there's a lot of things, but I feel there's so much out there that is linked to authenticity that affects us in our day-to-day lives that we don't realize. And so I'm also a big nerd. I mean, I'm big on growth and development. I read stuff that, I share with people and they're like, "What are you talking about? Like, this is so dumb." So so I'm excited to dive in this stuff with you, Emily. And hopefully the stuff that we discuss, we may have questions, but a lot of times we're going to have insights. And I think these conversations are geared towards putting stuff out there in the universe for people to consider, what does their life look like and how can that quality improve if they're seeking for that. And so excited about these conversations that we're going to have.
Same. It's interesting that you say putting it out there in the universe because the more that I talk with individuals, the more this idea of finding purpose, finding meaning, finding something to go towards in life. And it's interesting. So I was talking to somebody else and he was talking about David Goggins. And a lot of what David Goggins talks about is that everyone is looking for some purpose outside of themselves, but the real purpose is to become the most that you can be and discover who you are on the deepest level possible. And I think that ties all into this idea of authenticity. And so I'm always curious, like, how did you come into this idea of authenticity? Kind of what was your story getting involved in this realm or this realization that authenticity is really impacts every aspect of your life?
It wasn't obvious. It was actually a long process for me. I think the funniest story for me is when I was a kid, I would say this a lot, and I don't know if it was a thing of my age group, like a phrase or whatever, but I used to say all the time, like, "Man, you're just like so fake. That guy's so fake," or "That girl's so fake." And so there's something to be said about authenticity and genuineness, right?
Yeah.
Because as a young kid, if I was saying something like that over and over again, I think back like what was triggering me, right, to say something, and why did that matter? So fast forward to my adult life, had a lot of challenges, life experiences that eventually led me to narrow down um, what it means to be authentic and why it's more necessary today in today's world than it was, in the past. So that whole process took a while. It wasn't obvious. It was a lot of learning to do what I'm doing. It was a lot of interaction. It was a lot of experience with others. It was a lot of, and as I started to learn and see patterns and make connections, I started to realize like, wow, authenticity impacts every single area of our life. And we seem to be presenting ourselves in not as authentic as we used to. And it's always been a challenge, but in today's world, there's so much external stimulation. And so that has caused a lot of, presenting ourselves in a way that isn't really authentic to us. And so learning some of that, and I think this is the final thing I'll say, is that in the growth and development, you come across, ideas and thoughts from individuals that, have the science and the history and, it all stems from the past, these messages. And so one of the messages that I heard um, in recent times for me in my life and why I chose this pathway was from Gabor Mate, who is, an expert in the field of trauma and what that all means. I mean, he's so fascinating, the depth of his understanding. And of course, there's more to learn, but he made a statement that really aligned with what I was discovering. And he said that out of many needs that we have, there's two that are embedded within us. that are conflicting. And one is the need to attach. As humans, we need connection and, to be in relationships and communities. And the other need that we have is to be authentic, to be ourselves. And he pointed this out and he made this highlight, and he says over and over again that we forego our authenticity to be in contact, right? To be attached with others. And even when those attachments are poor and unhealthy, we still forego our authenticity because that need to feel connected is much more stronger throughout life. And so we begin to bury. So our authenticity is present, it's there. We just don't live based off of it. And the last thing I'll say is when that information became very clear to me, and then I put all these things together with my experiences in helping people and working with communities. Um, this other piece of information just made it make more sense, and it was the idea that our subconscious and how that operates dictates 95% of how we live our lives.
Yeah,
That
it's
means,
crazy when
right?
you realize that 95% of the actions that we do or don't take are from our subconscious. But I think what's really interesting is what you hit on was this need to feel connected, especially to those around us, to have that safety and security, to be part of something, and that even goes into purpose. But it's interesting because as we're kids, we only know life and we learn life through others. We need that attachment and everything to everybody else. But it's interesting because the more work that I've done on myself, it always comes back to myself. So when I think about having relationships with others and having this connection with others, what I realize is that I can only be connected to others to the extent that I'm actually connected with myself. So
Mm,
to the extent that I'm connected with my authenticity and who I am truly is to the extent that I can be connected with others. Because I feel like, or this was my experience a little bit, was trying to find that connection, trying to find that worth in others, trying to be who they thought they wanted me to be, or who I thought they wanted me to be. I kept getting more and more disconnected, not just from them, but from myself as well. And so the more disconnected I was from myself, the more disconnected I was from them. And it's
mm,
interesting because what I found too on my journey was that the more that I allowed myself to be who I am, the more that I released this need to be what I like to call the shitty shoulds of life. It's funny because as I allowed myself to be myself, I actually allowed others to be themselves as well. So the judgment of those that I had on others, it started to dissipate as I stopped judging myself. Because we're
mm,
constantly, everybody's like a mirror into ourselves. It's I don't know, have you ever heard of it's Byron Katie. It's called The Work.
mm,
So one of her things with the work is you always, whenever you judge somebody, you turn that judgment back on myself. So for instance, say that you're saying, oh, my husband should be taking out the trash. This is a silly example, right? She
mm.
says, turn around and say, I should be taking the trash out. And then you're like, oh, I'm the one that wants the trash being taken out. So it's realizing that every judgment we have on others is actually a judgment on ourselves. And you're like, oh, that's so fascinating.
It is. And you brought up something really interesting, and I actually dove into this. I dive into topics, right? And so, again, big nerd. And so you mentioned when you started sharing that when you feel connected with yourself, it's easier to feel connected to others. And what I discovered in this dive of connection actually really aligns and supports what you're saying. And the opposite, right? When you're disconnected with self,
Yeah.
your connections with others are poor. And of course, there's a lot of skills that people can use. I think boundaries is one of the most wonderful, amazing skill sets that you can develop over time that people really don't know the
Let's talk
power it
about
has.
boundaries. Let's no,
Okay.
I think boundaries is it's such a great topic, but also a very misunderstood topic because I don't know if you
Mhm.
found this too, but I found as I was learning about this thing called boundaries, and like you hear everywhere, set boundaries on others. And I was like, hold on a second. Are we supposed to be setting boundaries on others? Or are we actually supposed to be setting them on ourselves? I think I read you this quote that I had on my Instagram last time we talked, and it was interesting because it actually saw it on somebody else's Instagram, and they said, "Who is the person who took you the longest to heal from?" And so everybody was like listing out, whether it's their exes or their mother or their father or the death of a child or death of a grandparent. I was like, wait a second, myself. It was
Mm,
interesting because the person that I was healing from was actually myself. Yeah, so I always said like healing isn't from anyone or anything, but rather it's an integration and reconnection of those parts that have been disconnected. I like to say that we break to see what is inside the layers that we've been hiding beneath. And I
mm,
think that goes to boundaries too, because when we set boundaries, it's telling ourselves what are the standards we're holding ourselves to. Because we have to allow others to be right where they are on their journey, to be who they want to be. Doesn't mean we have to interact with them, but that we can put the boundaries in ourselves to say, I'm going to hold myself accountable for this. So that self respect, that self trust, and then allow others to be right where they are on their journey, just as we're allowing ourselves to be right where we are. So, talk to me a little bit more about boundaries in your eyes. How do you use boundaries?
so yeah, no, boundaries is incredible. When I discovered them, it was a messy process, like many things that we experience in life, right? There's very few things that we're like we do it for the first time. It's like, oh my gosh, that was awesome. It was mostly it's a mess. So, so the idea of boundaries started in a very rigid way. And right before I jump into that, I want to finish off the this idea of connections, right? Connection to self and connection to others. When I did a deep dive, I learned that a connection is literally from one point and another point of contact. That's it. It doesn't go anywhere else. It's from one point of contact to another point of contact. What relationships are is a layered, integrated system of connections. So when people say like, right, their relationships are, they're hard to have relationships, I ask them one simple question. What one instant did you make effort to change the dynamic of that relationship? And it starts a conversation, right? Because the answer can be anything. But the thing about connection is that if you realize the difference between connection and relationship, then you start to understand that, like, gosh, if I want my relationship to be shaped a certain way, I got to improve the quality of those connections, those momentary connections. And that's the word that stands out to me the most was moments. Those are just moments. Connections are moments. And so like when I take my kids for granted, right? Because I see them every day, I get to do some things here and there with them. But if I'm like, well, I have a good relationship with them, my relationship is never going to be enhanced if I don't pay attention to the moments that I have with them. And
Oh,
each of those moments begins to shape then the relationship. And so that being said, right, boundaries comes in where uh, people describe boundaries as kind of like walls or something like that.
ooh, yeah.
And the understanding of boundaries is it really, really comes down to the most basic thing in our human experience, um, in our interactions with others, and it's safety. How do I feel safe in this situation? How do I feel safe? And you mentioned, right, the boundaries with others, and then you realize boundaries with self. You have to feel safe within yourself, right? And
Ooh,
so, what boundaries are
okay.
you setting for yourself, right?
Okay. I love that. There's two things that come to mind when you say that is, how do you feel safe enough within yourself to be able to have those boundaries? Because if you don't feel safe enough within yourself, then you're always looking for something external of yourself to feel safe. That was
Yeah,
actually
that's the
that's a
power.
really powerful insight Um, because I also had thought of boundaries as a respecting of ourselves. But the fundamental level, what you got to was really, you can't even set boundaries on yourself or with yourself, I should say, if you don't feel safe enough within yourself to do it. Because until you establish
Yeah.
that connection of safety with yourself or that trust or that relationship, you're always looking to somebody external or something external of you to provide that.
Right. They play off of each other, right?
Yeah.
So, do I feel safe within myself right now? No. So then I should set a boundary for myself, right? And
Yeah.
then let that go through its process. And then now let's say I reach a certain level of safety within myself. Okay, do I feel completely safe? No, I could probably do a little bit more. What other area of my life do I need to set boundaries for myself with, right? And then I start setting boundaries for myself. This process can be simultaneous, and it's messy. It's not designed for you to like set boundaries and like your life is set, right? It's going to be a process. And so
Yeah.
once you establish your process to
Yeah.
set boundaries, you begin to see the long-term effects, and the safety allows you to have more courage, allows you to
Yeah.
understand and seek validation within yourself as opposed to externally, right? If you don't, if going back to that statement that stood out to you, where like if you don't feel safe within yourself and you don't have boundaries, then you're going to seek safety externally.
Yeah.
That safety is so dangerous because you have no control
Yeah.
over it, right? And so
Yeah.
every time your life is going to be up and down, and you're going to seek ongoing validation because you're throwing yourself, and not your true self, but you're throwing yourself out there expecting something that's not possible. Like you
Yeah.
can't have someone who loves you tell you like what your value is and validate you on everything, because they have their own struggles, they have their own ups and downs. And if you ask them on the wrong time, the wrong day, the wrong way, they're going to tell you something like, oh my gosh, so I'm not, I'm not worth it. I'm not this and I'm not. And so now you dig yourself deeper. And so boundaries is all about safety,
Yeah.
safety within
I think,
myself, safety with others, right?
yeah. I think what really caught me as you were saying that was this progression of the boundaries. So it kind of reminds me of the healing journey. So like when you're at a really vulnerable or rock bottom state within your journey, or say even just saying, say you break a bone. Well, what do? We cast the leg or the arm or whatever broke because it's so vulnerable at that time that it needs to be all external things need to be removed from it so that can start the healing journey. But as it becomes stronger and as it heals, we can start removing the cast, maybe put a sling on it, maybe use some crutches. And then the more and more and more that we develop it, and more the stronger that it becomes, the more that we can integrate it back into the world. And so that was interesting with boundaries because we're reestablishing this sense of safety within ourselves. So sometimes our boundaries are extremely, you could say, rigid or strict, or in a way what I did was very isolating. So I isolated myself from kind of everything just to be able to do the internal work on myself without the external coming in. And so it's removing those stressors until we
Hmm.
get strong enough to where the stressors aren't affecting us, or we're not allowing them to affect us the way in which they used to, because we've got a deeper, a stronger relationship or connection with ourselves. So I think that was really fascinating because I even found with myself, my boundaries used to be extremely strict. They've transformed a little bit more to a way of like respecting what I want to create or who I want to become or things like that, because I've done so much of the inner work where it's like other external things can come at me, but they kind of just bounce off. They kind of just bounce off
Mm.
because my boundaries are like selective. Things can come in, but other things, they can come at me all the time, but it doesn't really affect me. I think so. That was like really a really interesting and powerful way of looking at boundaries as a progression of developing this safety within oneself.
Yeah, no, and it's a very fluctuating progression.
Yeah.
And that's what is so like
Cool.
I think exciting about this is it's not a fixed system. It's not a fixed process. And so I'll describe a little bit about kind of the clarification of what boundaries are. So boundaries are limits that you set, right? You set them for yourself, you set them for others. And what you're limiting is the distance of how someone interacts with you. So um, there are different boundaries, categories of boundaries, right? So there's like physical boundaries, there's mental boundaries, there's emotional boundaries, financial boundaries. So when you look this up, if people take the time, which would be great, right? Because that's the beginning to look things up and then start practicing. Now, when you look these things up, right, there's categories of boundaries. So those are areas where you can apply distances, those limitations, right? So for example, a physical boundary. So my physical boundaries are very like, I'll shake your hand, but I'm not going to hug you. I hug
Yeah.
my kids. You see the boundary? So the
Yeah.
limitation for people that I meet or that I know for some time is handshaking. That's
Yeah.
the physical boundary. And I'll give a perfect example. There was a particular patient that I had the opportunity to work with, and it was in a group setting. And this patient suffered from seizures.
Yeah.
And so they had one during our session. And I happened to be sitting next to this individual. And when they had it, it was kind of not a quick response from all of us, but
Yeah.
this person started to go to the ground. And I was able to catch this person before their head hit the ground and then help them off the chair. Um, and so what happened in the following days was that she came back after being, hospitalized. She came back and, she said, what happened? And people described what happened. So she came to me and she said, I want to thank you. And she came forward to give me a hug. And I stopped. I said, hey, I accept what you're sharing. And I'm just, I'm here to help. So some people might say, like, that was an appropriate moment for you to extend a hug to someone who was expressing appreciation for what you did. But this example is one of hundreds and hundreds of examples that I've had that testify to me the power of your boundaries when they're very clear. Even though from the outside, this might have looked like, oh my gosh, you should have been a little bit more open, right? Um, I've worked with boundaries for so long that I
Mhm.
know what they do over time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is what they do. So here's the purpose of boundaries is to
Yeah.
create safety, right? In this world. That's either within you or with others. So that's the number one purpose. The actual outcome is trust. That's the
That's
outcome
actually what
of,
I was thinking.
yes,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
trust. People will trust you more when they know where you stand all the time. You don't waver. And then you decide when that boundary changes, right? You
Yeah.
decide when that changes. And with my kids, I hug them all the time. But there are people that have been in my life for years and I'm still like handshaking. And then there are some that have been in my life for years and I'm hugging, right? Because my boundaries are very clear. There are certain individuals with a physical boundary that there are
Yeah.
limitations to. Like, I'm going to hold you out there because, like, it's not appropriate.
Yeah.
And these are the reasons why. And the thing is, when people don't know how to say no, a lot of times, that's one of the things that people struggle with. It's like, oh no, when you
Yeah.
have boundaries, and not only the outcome, not only the outcome is trust, which is the biggest thing. The other thing is your voice starts to come out in this world.
Yeah. It's
No,
it's
right?
interesting. There's a couple of things that come to mind as you're talking, a couple of examples. So as you're setting boundaries, what I've actually taught my clients is that and this goes right to what you're saying about not saying no, the fear of saying no is that the thing is when you set boundaries or you say no, or you say that it's actually respecting not just yourself, but the other person. Because when you're clear and you communicate, both of you guys know what you're doing. There's no miscommunication. There's a respect. And what I really love about this idea is this idea of respect. So it's interesting. I don't know why, but ever since I was little, I started babysitting when I was about 11. And it was always for families with about 4 kids. But it's interesting because I never had any issues with those kids at all because I had such clear boundaries with them that they knew exactly what to expect. And I think this is really important when you're talking about parenting because what kids really need are clear boundaries so they have a safe spot, so they know how to operate in this world, so they can go and explore within confines of safety. And then that second example that comes to me in this idea going back to saying no is when I was first coaching, my whole thing was serving my clients, but this actually wasn't serving my clients, just how I was doing. I was saying, oh, what works best for you in terms of like setting schedules or timing and things like that. The problem with that is saying that is all of a sudden you lose a little bit of that professionalism and it turns more into like oh, maybe we could do this. Like it loses that commitment that as a coach, you're trying to instill within your clients. Because as a coach, we're teaching our clients how to show up for themselves, how to take responsibility for themselves. And so if we don't exhibit those boundaries, how are they ever going to learn how to establish those boundaries?
Exactly.
Because, yeah, I think it's such an interesting and a deeper conversation that most people don't have in terms of boundaries.
Yeah, because it's scary. And it's interesting again, going back to authenticity
Yeah.
and how much is linked in our lives to authenticity, right?
Yeah.
The fact that people today, when I was a kid, people said no all the time, right? And even in years past, they said
Yeah.
no with no problem. And today, when I hear people, when I interact with individuals, one of the things that constantly comes up, where it's two of them and they're associated in some way, but one is people say they're sorry all the time,
Oof.
and then
Yeah.
people don't know how to say no. It's
Yeah.
so scary to say no, right? And so linking back to authenticity, the fact that we're living in an environment right now where people are struggling to say no for like simple things is
Yeah.
an indication that we're heavily leaning towards connection and attachment than authenticity, right? That's a sign in our society right now. If you cannot say no, it's a sign that you're living in a state of attachment. And it's so dangerous to be consumed by that because, and then you're not yourself. Then you're not being authentic. Then you're not learning what that means. You're not learning, what those things are. So boundaries plays a role in allowing someone to practice them, exercise them. Then there's trust, not only within yourself, but then with all interactions with other people. And when people trust you, just because of your boundaries, whether they listen to you or not, they already know where you stand. They don't even bother. Like one of the things I tell people all the time, it's really funny, is like, well, what if I say no and then they're gonna get mad? And what if I set a boundary and this is a very sensitive situation for them? What if they leave? And
Yeah.
then I say, what if they do leave? What
Yeah.
does that mean about their level of commitment and attachment to you, right? Because you say
Well, I
no.
think with that too, it's that idea that when you say one coach that I've listened to before, she goes, and so what? Because we say, what if they leave, but we never continue? Okay.
Hmm.
So the event happens and let's continue.
Yep.
Yeah.
There's a question. Oh my gosh, what was the question? I used to use it all the time. Oh, then what? Right? They would say like, oh,
Oh, and then,
and then they
yep.
would stop, and I'll say, then what? Then what happens? And
Yes.
then what happens? And then they follow this track, and it's interesting because they're doing it in a conscious way, but it's a very
Yeah.
much a subconscious technique, right? You
Uh-huh.
put yourself in a place,
Yeah.
and then you say, then what? So they left you, you're
Uh,
broke, you move in back with your parents,
Yep. Yep.
then what?
Yeah. Because this is where fear sets in. Fear is of the unknown. And so it's
Hmm.
really interesting because I do something called like fear setting. And it was something I took from Tim Ferriss. And he always goes, okay, make up the worst situation that you can think of. And then it's like, well, what are you going to do about it? How can you prevent it? And what are you going to do about it? Because and this is actually a visualization technique to start changing your life or becoming the person that you want to be is, okay, well, let's continue into the future. Let's teach ourselves or mental rehearse who we want to become.
Mm,
So it's that same thing. And then what? So what? We realize there's more than the present because we're always, as you know, with our subconscious, it keeps, it predicts from the past because it only knows the past. But we can consciously teach it a new future. If we continue with that, so what, then what? And what's next? Mentally rehearse what you're going to do. Athletes use it
mm,
all the time.
mhm.
They mentally rehearse, and there's studies. It's fascinating. They've done ones, I think, with like pianos, and then also with weightlifting, where they literally had subjects visualize themselves actually doing it. And when they tested them compared to the ones that physically practice, it was very similar, the results that they got. Because
Mm,
the person we are externally is because of the person we are internally. So when we change our internal state, when we change our identity, when we change who we are being inside, our external will reflect that. It just takes reality a hot second on the outside to catch up with our internal reality. And this is interesting. I don't know if I was talking with you or somebody else about this recently, but the difference, it was with you, between being and becoming.
mhm.
So if we're always becoming somebody, it tells our brain, we look at the subconscious, that if that's in the future, that's in the future, that's in the future. So it keeps pushing it out in the future because the present moment is constantly becoming the past. So you want to be the person right now, be that first evolution of that next person that you want to become. So constantly ask, what's that next? What's focus on the next step, the next step, the next step of being that person, of being that person, of being that person, of being that person, rather than telling I'm going to become that. Because when I say I am, well, it reconfirms yourself you're not. But you're saying I am being this person. I am being this person. I am being this person. Continue that evolution of being that person to become that next version. It's
Yeah,
that
no, that's an
continuation.
incredible process. Have you experienced that?
You know, yeah. As I was healing and everything, I just had to say, well, how does this person show up as? Who do they show up as? How are they acting? Who are they being? Constantly rehearsing to myself, who is this person? Who is this person? And one of my things that I love to do, I just actually learned about this technique recently is, so we look at these ideas of like positive thinking and affirmations, and we can talk about that. It's a whole nother level of misconception on there. But the thing is, when we tell our subconscious something that we are, say, I am beautiful, when subconsciously you don't believe that, in the back of your mind, your brain's gonna be like, yeah, right. Yeah, right. You can keep saying it out loud, but yeah, right. And so this is this whole idea of questions. And I've heard them called lofty questions. I call them subconscious filter questions, identity shifting questions. And it's always starts with, why am I?
Mm,
The problem is most people put, why am I so poor? Why am I not losing weight? And you're reconfirming to your brain's gonna be like, okay, this is what your subconscious does. It always reconfirms your beliefs and then it always answers every question you give it. Let's give it a different question. So say you want to lose weight. We say, why am I so fit and healthy? Why am I making such great decisions? Why do I have so much energy? And your brain will be like, let me figure that out for you. Let me figure that out for you. So when you put these subconscious questions in your brain, of the person you want to become, your brain's like, let me figure out why. So some of the questions I was always asking was like, well, why am I so clear on what I'm doing? Why am I so productive? Why am I so focused? Why do I have so much energy? Why am I communicating in such a clear, concise way? Why am I adding so much value that my clients need and want and can actually use? And so it's asking these questions of, who do I want to become? So why am I? Because when we start asking why versus how, we don't know the how. But when we start asking why, our brain's like, well, why could we? Why could we? And so it comes up with so many different things because how kind of almost limits us to like a linear process and wants us to think about one solution when why could be like, oh, what are all the possibilities?
mhm.
Yeah, so it activates that RAS system, the reticular activating system within our subconscious that actually filters and focuses on things. So it's that whole idea of like when you get like a car and like, oh my God, there it is, there it is, there it is. So we can use questions to be like, oh, there it is, and direct our mind to it. Um, yeah. So it's fascinating. I mean, that could be a way of setting boundaries too on your thought process without fighting it. So staying in that
Oh
curious
yeah,
mindset.
that would be a
Yeah.
great actually approach to setting boundaries because it
Yeah.
starts again with, that 95% of how we operate, right, is by
Yeah.
the subconscious, which means the subconscious has its own blueprint and its own way of functioning. And then consciously, we're trying to change it, but it's like painting a house, right? The house is already
Yeah.
built, it's designed and everything. And then you're painting the house thinking, like, this is going to be a new house, and you're just painting the outside. The conscious is painting the outside. The
Yeah.
subconscious is the structure and foundation and the design of the home, right?
Yeah.
And so, what you're describing is so true to this idea that we need to redesign the home, right? We're going to do a remodel, right? And then
Yes.
there's going to be that true change. It's like, oh my gosh, there's another bedroom. Now we have a playroom, right? And so, what people focus on a lot is the conscious, right? The directing.
Yeah.
And that skill, I mean, it's awesome. The asking the subconscious or, through the nervous system, like saying
Yeah.
like, why am I having why am I having such great experiences with all my relationships?
Yes.
Then your
Yeah.
subconscious starts to remodel because it's trying to answer that, is what you're saying,
Yes.
right? If I'm getting you right.
Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, because we can consciously direct our subconscious when we understand how it operates. Because it's just like you said, the subconscious is just that system trying to keep us safe, trying to find love, trying to keep us secure, and things like that. So if we teach it a new way of being, it's going to be like, okay, but you have to make sure that you teach it as a safe way of being. But it loves to reconfirm beliefs because predictability is safety to the mind. And then it loves answering questions. Like it
Hmm.
always loves finding answers and looking for things that reconfirm your own biases. Because when it reconfirms your biases, it actually increases the amount of safety within your subconscious because it's saying, oh, I see the evidence. Oh, I see the evidence. Oh, this is true. Oh, this is true. This is true. And so you can actually remodel your subconscious. Now, there's layers in which, as we're doing that, you'll start seeing things where you become resistant or you see patterns that keep coming into your life. Those are when you do the deeper work of understanding, well, where do those patterns come from? What am I making them mean? How do they serve me? Things like that. That goes into a different layer of like unblocking the subconscious and understanding how and why it's got programmed. But you can really start to teach your subconscious a new way. So it's this idea of, do we go back into the past all the time or do we focus forward? And I think it could be a combination of both
Hmm.
because sometimes the past doesn't matter. Sometimes we can just focus forward. So you've got like a lot of different tools that kind of intertwine together.
Yeah, I mean, the past is integrated already. So the past has caused some
Yeah.
functional, right, thing in us
Yeah.
already. And so our system is already operating that way. It's already
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh, when you did this, you got hurt. Don't do
Yeah.
it again. And so your body already knows, oh, don't do it again, because your
Yeah.
your fight or flight kicks in, like, oh my gosh, it's happening again. Um, and that's interesting because sometimes these things that we've recorded, um, they're not always necessarily true. We just
Yeah.
perceive them as that way. And so now we're operating in an unhealthy way and we don't realize it. And we're trying to change and we're trying to change, but our body's telling us like, hey, we can't do that. Like it's scary. So how do you in electrical way, right? How do you like how do engineers say like how do you bypass or go to the
I
next for a change? It's
it's
the
definitely
questioning, it's what you're saying.
yeah, it's questioning it because it teaches you a new way of safety. I think though too, it's dangerous to almost say like bypassing anything. It's not bypassing. What I like to go in is understanding how at one point that way of being or that way of operating actually did serve us. There's a reason that our subconscious adopted those ways of being, those habits, those patterns, those beliefs, because at one point they actually did serve us. Even say, for instance, like you were in an abusive house and things like that. Well, when you're younger, it was the way in which you coped and responded to that situation. probably was the best way you could at that point. Or say you've gone through extreme emotional trauma and you go to alcohol or over exercising or overeating or under eating or overworking. Well, sometimes the brain cannot handle that level of emotional stress that we have to numb out. And at that time and place in the acute, so we're talking acute versus chronic. So in the
Mm-hmm.
acute time, it actually did serve a purpose. The problem
Mm-hmm.
is once we're back into that physical safety, our brain is still operating from that mental fear of, oh, it can happen again, it can happen again, it can happen again. The subconscious always using the past to predict the future. And so that fear is there. So then we have to reestablish, understand, well, how did that serve us? So kind of integrating that and saying, okay, I'm reteaching a new way of being safe.
Mm.
So I think we
The
have to understand
remodeling.
both
Yeah.
the remodeling because we don't want to fight ourselves
Mm-hmm.
because fighting is such a resistance and it scares. If we think of I like to think of our subconscious like a 5-year-old, it scares our subconscious when you're fighting it because it's like, I'm just trying to help you. I'm just trying to help you. I'm trying to keep you safe. And it doesn't understand anything. And
Right.
like even when you use, I always love this one, like when you use the word not, so like with 5-year-old, if you tell them not to do something, like don't touch the stove, put that, like, don't touch that. They're like, I don't know what not to not do. So all they just kind of ignore the not and they're like, okay, touch that. And the
Yeah.
subconscious is the same thing because it can't read between the lines. It's like a 5-year-old. You literally have to be extremely direct. And that's one of the issues with goal setting too, is people like, I want to quit smoking. I want to lose weight. The body's like, well, lose weight. What does that mean? Weight? Quit smoking. What does that mean? Smoke? You literally have to tell it, well, I want to start, like eating healthier. So define what healthier means. So I'm shopping around the perimeter of the grocery store. I'm working with a coach. For stop smoking, it's like, um, I'm utilizing, you could say, yoga or walks or I breathe clean air, or it's like, what are you doing instead of this action? Because
Mm-hmm.
also, too, if you take away an action, you've got a hole there. You got to fill it with something.
Yeah, right. It's input and
Yeah.
output. Like if you don't fill it in with something,
Yeah.
your system fills it in with something.
What it
And
knows.
usually, yeah, what it knows. And it usually is going to do the same thing, right? And so like there's no change. And it's
No.
incredible. This process of change is so much more deeper than saying like, oh, I'm going to go to the gym because I want to be more fit. And
Yeah.
everyone in the world knows like it doesn't work, right? You say like, "Oh, I'm committed. I'm going to go to the gym." And then you go for the first month and then what happens? Like January and February look very exciting in the gym. And then what happens?
All right, so this is interesting because we are so conditioned to continuously operate from the past because it's so known. It's because we practice it over and over again, right? So I was reading one of Dr. Joe Dispenza's blogs a while ago, and he said the reason that so many people fail at their New Year's resolutions is because it's so much easier to forget the vision of your future than it is of your past. And so that goes back into that whole idea of like mental rehearsal. So constantly being that person internally before you are externally. So it's focusing on goals from a state of who is this person being? How are they thinking? And more importantly, how are they feeling?
Hmm.
And then from that state and asking those questions, well, naturally, those habits, as your brain's like, well, let me be this person. Like, how do I be this person that you keep telling me internally I'm going to be? Things start to like pull to you and gravitate towards you and like become magnetic to you.
Oh my gosh, yeah. It's so weird that it happens that way
Yeah.
because, coming, from like a, fixed, mindset and stuff like that, there was an understanding of certain things. And when people would say like, oh, energy, and then thing comes to you, it's like, you guys are
What does that mean?
crazy.
Yeah.
You guys
Yeah.
are nuts. Like, what are you talking about?
But it's a
But oh my gosh,
practice. It's a
yeah.
practice because you have to be in the beginning, it takes a lot of energy. You have to be so aware of constantly asking. I love to ask myself, okay, so what's my intention for the day? Who am I going to be? How I'm going to show up, things like that. And then it's like during the day, you have to ask myself, like, who am I being? Who am I being right now? Who am I being? And then at the end of the day, who was I? Who was I being? And so constantly asking your questions and constantly setting the intention. Now, do we mess up all the time? Well, absolutely. It's a practice. You have to continuously practice being this person. and you have to be constantly aware. And the more that you start asking yourself those questions, the more that it just kind of be, I'll be like in a situation, I'll be like, well, who am I going to be in this situation? How do I want to show up? It's like a natural question that automatically goes into my mind. It's like, oh wait, how do I want to show up in this moment? And it's like you catch yourself in the beginning after you did the action. And you're like, oh, wait, is that what I wanted to do? And then the more and more that you practice this, the more that you can capture it like in the moment and then before the moment. And so it's a
Hmm.
practice.
And it's such a cool thing that you bring up because I think in our conditioning, in early stages of life, we don't see things as practices. We see them as like complete products, right? There's like a great soccer player, Lionel Messi, right? There's a quote he gets quoted by saying like, I've practiced, for 17 years to become an overnight sensation type of thing, right? And and so this idea of becoming is a process.
Yeah.
And I used to tell people like, hey, when you do the breathing, the box breathing or whatever, it's good for your body. It's going to be a healing thing. And that was at the beginning when I was learning about this stuff, and that was it, right? I changed the language to this is a practice for your body to get conditioned. And that conditioning is forever, right? It's like your body's going to need ongoing because situations change, your perspective changes,
Yeah.
things change, but you're not changing the subconscious. And here's the coolest thing I've come to realize
Yeah.
is all of my emotions are signals from the
Yeah.
subconscious,
Yeah.
like all of them. And they bring color to my life because they tell me like they're telling me something. And if I see it as like, oh, I'm so sad right now, I feel broken, and I see that as a state of being as
Yeah.
opposed to a signal,
Mhm. Yeah.
it is so challenging to live through life
It's
when
that dynamic.
circumstances change, right? It's so
Yeah.
crazy.
It's being dynamic rather than static. And I think as we're approaching an hour, because I think we want to start keeping these around, those 45 minutes to an hour range.
Mhm.
Before you go kind of like into wrapping this idea around boundaries and this idea of processes and this idea of becoming and dynamic and flow, I think what I want to talk about next time, which was this was such an insight, and it's like how you described it last time just made it like a knowing this idea of gray zones and the danger of being in gray zones because it's
Mhm.
always that question of why do we always hit rock bottom for us to need to or want to change, to catalyze that change. So I think that's actually going to be a great topic to talk about next time. But as we start closing up things, what are some of those things that you want to leave with people with?
I think for this particular
Yeah.
conversation, things that stood out to me, one, you brought up a process, and to me that really aligns with all of the information and studies and science and even your own human experience that m most of the things that we're struggling with are about a process,
Oh,
and we define them as static. Like, I'm broke right now. No, you're just in a process where your behaviors are not aligned with receiving the financial stability that you're seeking for, right? Or I never have a good relationship. I'm always going to be alone. Those are definite things. No, you're just in a process of recognizing something in your life isn't functioning
yeah.
well and it needs change. And what is that change, right? And
Yeah.
so I think for me what stands out is that's where authenticity to me shifted. And I'll end with this thought for whoever gets to view this, because it was very powerful for me to realize
Yeah.
this because I lived so sheltered for a lot of part of my life. And is that when I was younger, less life experience, some of the definitions I've had was this is me, take it or leave it. I don't care if you like it or not. This is me.
Yeah.
That me was a conscious design. It wasn't a subconscious. right? Me is not just my thoughts or my emotions, it's the whole entirety of me, right? My whole system. I'm going to put it that way. So there's
Yeah.
systems within my. So that being said, is authenticity to me now has evolved to it's a process of knowing yourself, the subconscious,
Yeah.
and then how do I present myself to the world? Do I want to align myself with this stuff inside of me and how I
Yeah.
function? And if I don't like it because it's not something I value, then how do I change it and then live authentically with it? Right. So it's hard for me to live authentically when I have already concluded this is what I am, this is who I am. I'm never going to
Yeah.
change this aspect of me, right? Because that's not a natural way of operating as a system. And
Yeah.
so authenticity to me is a process of knowing yourself, how you
Yeah.
function, which is 95% you have no clue. And then when you do discover it,
Yeah.
how do you present it to the world? That's
Yeah.
authenticity because I can discover something about myself and be like, oh, okay. And then that's it. But how do I present myself to the world? Because that
Ooh.
presentation is going to be where my body says, yes, you're being you
Love.
right now, right?
Yeah.
And so process. Authenticity to me is a process of discovery and presentation. And that's what I take from this discussion.
Powerful. Because what I wanted to say to people is ask yourself right now, where are you right now? Where are you right now in your process, in your journey? And then ask yourself, will I give myself permission to be right where I am? And then give myself permission to admit what I actually need right now in this moment. What boundaries do I need to set on myself and others around me so that I can
Mm,
continue in this moment in time, that moment that you used earlier, this moment in time where I am, so that I can continue becoming that person. And so this is actually really fun. And so I think Oscar and I we're gonna try to figure out maybe shoot, maybe get a little try to shoot for maybe one video a week or something like that and continue these conversations. Our next one, I think I really want to touch on the idea of the gray zone. So not
yeah.
waiting till we hit that tipping point. I mean, even my journey, like being hit over a sledgehammer where everything was taken away from me. And you're like, okay, I think I need to change now. No, but I just want to thank you again, Oscar. And we will put links, we'll figure out how to put links to everybody so you can connect with people wherever we're found, probably LinkedIn or websites, things like that. And if you guys have questions, reach out to us. We're kind of the beginning stages of figuring out how to use technology. So bear with us.
That's right.
And yeah, hopefully you've got something beneficial out of these conversations. All right, Oscar, it was an absolute pleasure.